Hey, Prince Bosco here with another video about the history of video games. And I'm going to be continuing off of where I was last time, where we just discussed all about where computers came from. And we got to the second generation, but we're going to stop talking about computers and go right into the video games. So, if you want to learn more about computers, search up yourself. 1959, the game changer was the PDP-1. It was created by Steve Russell and added a new concept that would really stay with people: the screen. Before this, the computer would spit out calculations or something on printed paper, but now a screen is available, giving quick responses, but it also started the trend of hacking. 1961, different interactive computers were being tested with on the PDP-1. Things like Mouse and the Maze and Tic-Tac-Toe. Those could be almost considered the first video games, but they actually weren't exactly a video game. Kind of. It didn't use video. In 1962, Steve Russell made a program that would show off the capability of the computer, and this made him create one of, if not the first actual video game, Space War, with an exclamation mark. Basically, you play as spaceships and you try to shoot down someone else's. But this video game is what began it all. 1963 to 1968, after Hiroshi Yamauchi meets with an American card company, finally realizes the limitations of just being a card company. I have a lot of papers here, so and that's as far as I go with just looking on the screen. Alright, so he begins expanding the business and began doing things like a taxi business, a love hotel, TV network, food company, and several other things. So Nintendo was just kind of experimenting right now. 1965, Rosen Enterprise and the Service Games merged, changing the name to Sega Enterprises. They took the first two names of Service Games, so S and GA, and put together Sega Enterprises. 1966, Nintendo releases a claw-armed toy and is moved by this thought of being a toy company and begins making toys. A man named Ralph H. Baer begins a project on the Brown Box console video game system and other prototypes for Defense Electronics Company Sanders Association. 1968, Mattel releases Hot Wheels. That's not a big deal, but Mattel comes later. I just found all these cool things. So 1969, Nolan Bushnell and colleague Ted Dabney formed Ziggy. I can't really say it, but let's just call it Ziggy, with the intention of producing Space War clone computer space. After trying to find a buyer, they finally found Nutting Associates. They don't sound too good. I'm not plagiarizing this. I've actually researched all this, so don't worry. To take them in. It was the first arcade game ever, but it was a failure, even though it sold 3 million copies, and no one blamed Nutting and left to find a better suitor. Meanwhile, Rosen sells Sega to Golf Plus Western. How could you do that, Rosen? Later becoming a branch. 1971, Mattel releases electronic keyboard toy. Releases electronic keyboard toy. This made electronics enter the handheld realm. And this is the first generation of video games, 1971 to 1977. And so this begins the video game industry. In this generation, we see the jump from arcades to home consoles. In 1972, Atari Inc. was incorporated and soon hired AI Acorn. And I have a little problem here, so one sec. AI Acorn as their first designer engineer. Nolan tested his abilities by making an arcade version of Magnavox Odyssey's tennis game, which was named Pong. Magnavox Odyssey is later released in the same year as the first home console. So far we just got the first home console, and that ain't half bad. Video games are finally underway. Atari has been founded, and competitors are bound to come. Arcades are in full force, and home consoles are not too far off. 1973, Atari made its own competitor by turning Nolan's next-door neighbor Joe Keenan into Key Games. Wow, so Nintendo fools around with laser games and bowling alleys and arcades, but drops it as they found their market. What is that market? 1974, Key Games becomes a branch of Atari and secures the rights to Magnavox Odyssey. Also, Hot Wheels leaves Mattel. That's not a big deal, but man, my printer was just not working out at this point. So it's kind of hard to read, but do stay with me here. Okay, 1975, Nintendo jumps into the arcade gaming industry with so it came with the game EVR Race. That was their first ever game. And I can't read how this was printed out. So where was I? 1976, Atari begins work on a system to play its games. It searches for a buyer. And Coleco, if you remember from earlier, Coleco releases its first video game console, the Telstar, which could only play one game, and so many different ones were made. Fairchild Channel F jumps into the industry with the new... Fairchild Semiconductor jumps into the industry with the new Fairchild Channel F. So a lot of people are just shoving stuff into the industry. 1977, Atari found Warner Communications, and so the Atari 2600 was born. Originally the Atari VCS video computer system. But Atari and Warner Communications argue about where the company was headed, and Nolan thinks the Atari 2600 should be discontinued. Sears, I don't know where the heck this came from, creates telegames and copies the system and begins producing for it. Nintendo begins making its own hardware, messing with the color TV game. Many arcade games have now been out and doing well, such as Pong, Star Trek, Maze War Adventure, Dungeon, and Zork. Telstar released its last version, which can play multiple games. But with Pong losing its lust, Coleco almost goes bankrupt. Many continued to enter the video game race, and so a company called RCA, which you might have remembered from earlier, markets the RCA Studio 2. It was black and white and could only beep. It was an epic fail in the industry. A team at Midway released the home console called Bally Astrocade. Alright, and so the second generation of video games, 1977 and 1983. Atari 2600 dominated much of this generation. The arcade industry was booming, which fueled the video game industry, but mostly Sega, due to that is what Sega did for a long time. So, 1978, a Magnavox Odyssey Squared, I guess, was released and just acted as a sequel to the original. Key Games was finally dropped and Nolan was fired after an argument. Ooh. Mattel creates a sub-company called M Network and begins making games for the Atari 2600, but when Atari makes Atarisoft and publishes games on the Astrocade, they sue. Wow, that's some sportsmanship, I gotta tell you that. Jeez. Can't have it both ways. 1979, Atari makes some 8-bit computers like Atari 800 and Atari 400. Gunpei Yokoi gets an idea for a handheld video game system, which he works at Nintendo. Activision is founded after some disgruntled Atari members left and made their own company, and that was the first third-party publisher in video games. Milton Bradley tried out video games with their epic fail with the Microvision. The Microvision was a handheld, but since it was so bad it barely counts, although its games are extremely rare today. In the PC gaming world, PC 8000 is dominating. 1980, Mattel comes out with another video game system known as Intellivision, and even though being out much before the 16-bit era, it had a unique 10-bit processor. It also had an advanced sound chip. Namco publishes the legendary Pac-Man. Nintendo comes out with the first handheld video game system and calls it the Game & Watch. The Game & Watch lacked the ability to change games, but many different ones were made. It was also known for its easy portability and the ability to act as a clock as well. Warner is thriving off of the computer and video game console sales, but the two rarely worked out together. But this wasn't a thought for the company. Atari was getting frustrated with the little cooperation that was happening between the two. Mattel's Intellivision was a huge competitor and the price war was raging. The success of Atari 2600 was never duplicated. So many companies wanted to add the fast-growing industry. Atari, Warner, Nintendo, Midway, Mattel, Fairchild Semiconductor, RCA, Coleco. The industry grows rapidly, but it was growing too fast and too much. The companies were speeding towards a wall, and only so many will make it through. In 1982, the Commodore 64 is released and PC gaming flourishes on the computer, its competitors being the Atari 8-bit family and the X series. Sega released its first 3D game, Sub-Rock 3D. Nintendo releases Donkey Kong to arcade and it's a smashing hit. Emerson Arcadia 2001 is released by the Emerson Radio Corporation as its foot in the race. Coleco releases ColecoVision to keep itself in the industry. The ColecoVision was a huge hit. Atari releases the Atari 5200 to compete with the Intellivision, but ended up being ColecoVision's biggest competitor. It was based off of the computer Atari 400 and 800. The controller was the system's biggest downfall, and Atari was slipping from the race. Vectrex joined the industry as well by GCE and was the first system to offer 3D peripheral, predating Sega's. It came with its own screen and had an interesting line of visuals with no color. It was a neat system, but GCE just couldn't keep up with the cost. Eventually, Milton Bradley bought GCE, and continued to produce them for only 2 years. Coleco was still wanting more and made an ad-on for the ColecoVision to be able to play Atari games. They were sued and were forced to withdraw the idea, but they still wanted to win. 1983, Nintendo launches the family computer, Famicom, console with Nintendo's most popular arcade games on it. Coleco decided that they wanted to copy Atari's Atari 2600 by launching the Coleco Gemini. And so Coleco versus Atari had begun. The major difference between the systems were the controller design, but Coleco sold away the Gemini and so the rivalry ended. But as you could tell, there are so many systems all at once, and with crappy third-party publishers and overwhelming computers, the video game industry crashed. Video game crash, 1983 to 1985. As mentioned above, the three reasons for the crash was too many consoles and the sales were spread too thin. Computers beginning PC gaming and their abilities. And finally, the third-party publishers being very bad. Many companies went bankrupt and many consoles failed. Coleco was forced to abandon the video game industry completely and turn to computers to stay afloat and released the Coleco Atom home computer. Warner became desperate and looked for buyers. Atari and Nintendo began work on the Famicom, but Atari's financial problems and the Famicom's runaway success Nintendo went on alone. Activision survived due to also developing games for PCs. Sega was doing so good with arcades until this happened. Deciding to try it out for the hell of it, they released the SG-1000. Mattel went to Nintendo and struck a deal with them. The Mattel would release the Famicom to other countries. Nintendo redid the Famicom and renamed it to the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the NES. The NES didn't do as good as due to Mattel failing to release the SG-1000 taking sales. Due to this, Nintendo kicked Mattel out. Mattel left the video game industry and went back to toys. Atari left Warner and bought the rights to the system and became Atari Corporation. Atari Corporation made computers such as the Atari ST, Atari XE, and the Atari 520 ST. Atari then launched two new game consoles under Warner, the Atari 2600 Junior and the Atari 7800, but the Atari 7800 only had a limited release. In 1985, Super Mario Bros. Is one of the highest grossing video games ever and practically revived the video game industry along with the NES. But in order to appeal to parents and make it look like a toy, Bob was introduced, which is the robotic operating buddy. 1986, Sega took advantage of North America's situation by releasing the Sega Master System. It did very well and was a huge competitor of the NES. NES. Alex Kidd made his debut in this system. The Legend of Zelda series begins, and Dragon Quest. Generation 3 of video games, 1983 to 1995. This generation has been very fast-paced with the industry booming and then coming to a sudden halt, but this was the beginning of something great, and so, the next generation on the horizon, Nintendo and Sega led the industry down the path to the future. It's hard to tell right now, but the gaming industry was better than ever. With the NES and SMS, things look bright, and so video games rise to the occasion and continue forward. So that is the next part of the video games. It's a nice beginning, but what will happen up to now? Stay tuned to find out. See ya. Stay awesome.